Nino Borsari, the King of Carlton. A long time ago in Cavazzo in Italy, there lived a little boy named Nino. He was born during the Great Depression, a time of terrible hardship in the world. There was no money, no jobs, and very little food to eat. To make matters worse, poor little Nino was an orphan, and he had to fend for himself. Sometimes he was so hungry he would eat grass. Other times he lived on polenta. But there was one thing Nino loved to do above everything, and that was ride his bicycle. The old chemist of Cavazzo had given him a rusty old iron bike so Nino could deliver medicines around the town. And when he had finished his work for the day, he would ride around the beautiful countryside and forget his troubles. Sometimes he would dream of being a champion cyclist, and he often watched as the professionals rode through his town. One day, Nino was in the town's main street when he heard the distinct sound of whirring bike wheels. A team of cyclists was whizzing past him, and he decided just for fun he would pretend he was a famous rider too. He was up and away, pedalling furiously alongside the professional cyclist, as fast as his legs could take him, and he was keeping up with them. At the edge of the town he stopped, and as the others rode away, he waved goodbye. Ciao, ciao! The next week, the same thing happened. Nino rode with the professional cyclists and kept up with them all the way through the town. Every week, he would be waiting for them. Now, after a while, the professional riders noticed the little boy and how fast he rode. Today, let's sprint through the town and try and give that little boy the slip, said a rider. But Nino just pedalled faster, and he kept up with them. He'll be a champion one day, said another rider. And he went and saw the old chemist, and together they bought Nino a new racing bike. Nino began to train like the professionals. He had a fiercely competitive nature, and he worked very hard. Year after year he trained. In 1929, when he was 18 years old, he became cycling champion of Italy. A few years later, even though he was a sprint rider, he won a place in the Italian 4-kilometre team pursuit at the 1932 Los Angeles Olympic Games. The Italian team won the gold medal, and Nino was on top of the world. Little Nino had grown into a handsome young man with thick, dark, wavy hair and a fine physique. While he was in America, he was offered a screen test in Hollywood. They thought Nino had the makings of a movie star, but cycling was his first love, and he said no. His next big race was in Australia, organised to celebrate the centenary of the Port Phillip settlement. He didn't win, but he did fall in love with the country and its people. Nino continued to race in worldwide events before he came back to Australia in 1939 to ride. World War II broke out, and Australia was at war with Italy. Italians living in Australia were now enemies, and they were locked away. Not Nino. He was a famous Olympiad, but the authorities told him, no bicycle racing until the end of the war. Nino was stuck. He could not return to Italy, and he could not ride his bike. He would have to find a house and a job. Nino had always been a favourite of the crowds, and a group of businessmen offered to help him set up a bicycle repair shop. It was on the corner of Lygon Street and Grattan Street in Carlton. Nino had neon Olympic rings and a cyclist made to sit on top of his shop to advertise his business. It is called Borsari's Corner. It was during the war that Nino met and married Fanny Chester, a classically trained opera singer, and they had 2 children together. Nino and Fanny stayed in Carlton during the war, but finally it was over. Nino had become so fond of Melbourne, he decided to stay. He was well respected and a very successful businessman. He opened a second-hand dealer shop, and he called it Borsari's Emporium. He imported lots of wonderful things from Italy for his shop, and they say it was Nino Borsari who imported the first cappuccino machine into Australia. Everybody thought he was mad because nobody drank coffee in Australia in those days. Of course, now they are everywhere. He imported the famous Bianchi bicycle range, and he introduced Melburnians to the game of bocce. Now the war was over, he could get back to his bicycle racing. One of his favourite rides was the Herald Sun tour through country Victoria. Nino said, "The people of the towns would come out to greet us, children waved their flag, and every night tables of food were laid out for us. There was great excitement when the races come to town." The countryside of Victoria was beautiful in places, and I imagine myself back in Cavazzo, a young boy who liked to race the wind. After the war, many Italians immigrated to Australia, searching for a better life. Like Nino, they had to look for jobs and homes to live in. But work was not easy to find, and people were mean to the Italian immigrants. Some considered them still as enemies. Nino set out to help these people, like others had helped him on the way. His shop became like an information centre for Italians. "Nino, where do I get a job? Nino, where do I buy spaghetti?" Nino became famous for helping these Italian settlers, and they called him the King of Carlton. Nino was very generous, and he was known to be a mad keen sportsman. He founded the Juventus Soccer Club in Melbourne and sponsored many boxers to visit Australia. Nino loved to freely dispense information about cycles and racing. Nino loved Melbourne, and before the 1956 Olympic Games, Nino travelled to London as an Olympic delegate to state the case for his city hosting the Games. The International Olympic Committee weren't sure. "Melbourne? Isn't that a backwater?" they asked. "Oh no," said Nino with pride, and he told them, "They built a continent in less than 100 years. Australians are hard-working and very dedicated. They will be the best Games ever." Melbourne hosted the 1956 Olympic Games, thanks to Nino, and there's so many other things to thank him for. Old Nino Borsari died in 1996, a much-loved and admired person. Cycling continues to be a favourite pastime in Victoria. Every day, colourfully lycra-clad cyclists take to the road. Next time you see them whiz past, think of that little boy in Cavazzo long ago who raced the wind to become a cycling champion and travelled halfway across the world to call Melbourne his home.